Every garden is built on assumptions. We assume the soil will carry us through the season. We assume a sunny spot will stay sunny. And we assume that more plants equal more food. Those assumptions seem reasonable until the season proves otherwise in ways you didn't expect. I'm breaking down 4 assumptions I made in the 2025 garden that limited my yield and what I'm doing differently in the 2026 season to get ahead of them. The first assumption was that if I fertilized well early in the season, that would be enough to carry my crops throughout the year. And early on, that seemed to be true. In my front yard garden, I noticed the problem with my broccoli early. It was half the size of the broccoli growing in my backyard, and it was starting to form heads way too early. This is often a sign of stress and the broccoli trying to finish up before it dies. After harvesting the broccoli, I planted a butternut squash in the same bed. The butternut squash plants were slow from the start. Their leaves were pale and yellow, and it never really built any momentum. In the backyard, the pattern was different. The broccoli did great. There were no red flags at all. But once the broccoli came out and I planted my next succession of crops, is when I started to notice there was issues. My pepper grew well and started producing fruit, but once the fruit started to form, I saw some end rot. That's when it became clear that it wasn't a specific crop issue. It was the soil, and it was showing its limits at different points in the season. In the front yard, I think it's an organic matter and soil structure issue. That bed gets covered in piles of snow from shoveling the driveway in the winter. It is hard and compacted from the weight of the snow and ice. And I think salt probably plays an issue. In the backyard, the soil structure is much better. I think it's a nutrient issue. Broccoli is a heavy feeder, and I didn't do a good enough job making sure there was enough nutrients left in the soil when I planted my next succession of crops. What I had assumed would carry the soil throughout the whole season is the fertilizing I did in early spring. What happened is when the crops got stacked, the nutrients ran out. In 2026, I'm planning soil support based off of crop sequencing, not just planting date. Instead of assuming the soil will carry my crops throughout the season, I'm treating each planting as part of a chain. What comes out of the bed matters just as much as what goes into it. That means adding more compost before planting, using fertilizer more intentionally, including calcium, and mulching more consistently so that water remains in the soil and nutrients doesn't leach out. This winter, the backyard in-ground beds are already mulched with fallen leaves and the tops of carrots from my fall harvest, building organic matter before the season even gets started. The second assumption was about the sun, specifically that if a bed looked sunny at planting time, it would remain sunny enough for fruiting crops all season long. This showed up most clearly with the acorn squash I planted underneath my tomatoes and the peas I tucked in behind my garlic. At planting time, everything looked fine. There was light, nothing looked crowded, there were no red flags. As the season moved forward, the taller crops matured and the light changed far more than I expected. The acorn squash grew but stayed small and produced very little fruit. The peas behind the garlic struggled too, but the acorn squash took the largest hit. What surprised me the most wasn't that shade mattered. I knew that. It's how much shade mattered to fruit production. Vegetative growth happened, the plants were alive and growing, but fruit set dropped dramatically. The real lesson here is partial sun is enough to keep plants alive, but it's not enough to make them productive. In 2026, I'm changing how I think about bed layouts because of this. Instead of intermixing tall plants with short plants and hoping they sort it out, I will be intentionally layering plants from tallest to shortest, depending on where the sun comes from. In that same garden space where I planted the tomatoes and winter squash, I'm still going to grow a combination of plants. The structure will just be different. This time, the tall tomatoes will be in the back. In front of them will be a mid-height crop of sweet peppers. And in the very front will be my shortest crop of the group, bush green beans. It is still layered and efficient. But now the height steps down instead of piling on top of itself. The third assumption is as long as the strawberries are protected, it's doing its job. And technically, it was. I used plastic netting to protect the strawberries from squirrels and my toddler who had discovered the strawberries and was eating them before they were ripe. The netting broke easily and constantly got tangled. It was a pain to remove the net every time I wanted to harvest, and because of that, I harvested less than once a week. I lost more than 3/4 of the harvest and eventually gave up on the netting altogether about halfway through the season. The most important part here isn't the pests, it's how one system choice affected three other behaviors. Because the barrier was hard to manage, it made harvesting harder. And because harvesting was harder, I picked less often. And because I picked less often, I didn't weed or maintain that bed as often as I should have. Strawberries didn't fail, the system did. In 2026, my standard of crop protection is simple. It has to be easy to live with. That means something that is sturdy, quick to open, that I can open with one hand, and that doesn't turn into a tangled mess every time I look at it. I plan to build a simple cage with a quick lift top. The strawberry bed itself isn't moving. I'm just changing how easy it is to get in and out of that bed. Because the moment a system causes friction, it changes how often you'll use it. Another assumption I made showed up in my broccoli bed, that planting more closer together would automatically lead to more food. I planted my broccoli about 18 inches apart in rows about a foot apart. Early in the season, it looked great. The beds filled in fast and the leaves were big and healthy. Nothing looked wrong. When it came time to harvest, the heads were smaller than they should have been. So in 2026, I'm doing something differently. I'm planting fewer broccoli plants at a wider spacing in order to see if they will give me larger heads and a larger yield overall from fewer plants. It's an experiment to see how spacing affects a crop like broccoli. I'm not just looking for larger heads. I'm looking to see if wider spacing with fewer plants will lead to an overall outcome of a higher yield compared to more planted closer together. And if it doesn't, it's still useful information. It'll tell me that within reason, more plants do equal more food. Either way, that bed's going to give me real data instead of another assumption. None of these assumptions were careless. They were reasonable and they worked until the season applied pressure. That's why reviewing assumptions matters just as much as reviewing outcomes. In 2026, I'm not changing everything about my garden. I'm just planning with more evidence and less assumptions. In the next video, I'll be reviewing which crops saved me the most money in 2025 at the grocery store and how that's affecting my planning for the 2026 season.